I'm Jonty Colchester. CPRW is the Welsh countryside charity, of which I'm the chair. We may not be one of the biggest charities in Wales, but we are one of the oldest. From being at the vanguard of the campaign to establish our national parks in the 30s to the 50s, through to campaigning to secure a sustainable future for our countryside and its communities. Farming is at the heart of these communities, and our farmers are the people who look after the countryside we are trying to protect. We have organised this event to bring together farmers, growers, policymakers, environmental organisations and the local community to discuss what the future has in store for Welsh food and farming. Collectively, we are not short of challenges: food security, the climate emergency, water scarcity, rising fuel and feed costs. So this is a really vital debate, and we all know it. We need to support our farming sector to move towards sustainable farming practices. We need to change the way in which we buy and consume food in Wales in order to ensure a future that is sustainable. In other words, just to clarify what that word means, that is economically viable for farmers without compromising the environment. This is the crux of the issue. Wales has a chance to introduce a sustainable farming system, providing affordable food, and Welsh Government are here today to talk about the proposed agricultural bill. We mustn't lose this opportunity to change, and that's down to all of us. The pressure can't just be absorbed by our farmers. We are all involved in this. Whether you're a farmer or not, we are all consumers of food. And given all the issues around food security and public health, we can't afford not to work with nature in a way that is regenerative and ensures the growth of a sustainable food and farming system that works for us all. We're looking forward to hearing what our panellists have to say, and I'd encourage you all to engage, but also be respectful of one another's points of view. There is a lot we can all agree on. Nature tells us everything we as humans need to know. There are no monocultures in nature. There is only diversity. And there are systems that work together from the soil up. Plants and animals, animals and people. Powys has a large concentration of intensive farm enterprises, which created a lot of concern locally. And so one of the aims of today is simply to bring us all together. Michael Pollan has written, "There is no such thing as cheap food. The real cost of food is paid somewhere, and if it isn't paid at the cash register, it's charged to the environment. It's charged to your health." What we are hoping to achieve today is for farmers to feel that the local community and policymakers understand the many challenges they are facing, and for consumers to really understand those challenges and the role they have to play themselves in sustainable transition. Our collection today will be for our young farmers who will have to face these challenges on all our behalf in the years ahead. I'll end as I began. Thank you all very much for being here, and all I would urge you to do is participate. Over to you, Gary. Gary wears many hats. He works part-time for social farms and gardens. He sits on numerous agriculture-related task forces and committees and is part of Wales's cross-party food group. He's also an expert caver and mountain rescuer, so we're in very safe hands. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Jonty. Actually, I'm feeling quite nervous about this one. We've got a large panel, a great diverse audience, and a lot to cover, as you mentioned. There's a lot of wider thinking that we've got to do around our environment, climate, nature, how we support that, but how we support our rural communities. One thing that I didn't add to my biography, I'm one of the recent intakes to Powys County Council as a new councillor. I look after one of the largest rural wards in Wales, and that's a challenge, but I've got some fellow councillors here as well today, which is great to see. So between us, we've all got to start working together, and we've got to think slightly differently, and we've got to really work out how we support our farmers and our growers and our communities to transition to a more sustainable position, I believe. I'm going to introduce those of my friends and colleagues on the panel. We're going to hear from Dave from Welsh Government, particularly around the Sustainable Farming Scheme. We're going to move on to Tyler then to present the case for Food Bill Wales, and then the panellists will have a chance to question, challenge some of that. But what I'm really keen to do is make sure we've got enough time to have some audience participation, question and answers from the audience, because I think that's really important for today. I'm here representing Food Policy Alliance Cymru. I should make that very clear. That's a group of people, and I've got some friends and colleagues here from FPAC as well. Organisations that have an interest, a regard across the whole food system, from fisheries to farming, to hospitality, to academia. And we've been meeting really quite regularly with others, trying to set a sort of a framework, a manifesto around what food policy might look like for better people, perhaps, and better planet, but still supporting those rural communities. And I know Jane's here as well in the back of the room. Food Manifesto Wales, been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of talking. There's similar events to this happening later on in November as well, down in Lampeter. Another chance to sort of come together to question, to challenge, and to support each other. So, Food Policy Alliance Cymru, have a look on the website, you'll see our manifesto, and then you'll see what our key asks of government perhaps are. And what we're actually really arguing for is an overarching food commission. Interestingly, like Scotland, have just agreed to put through in their government, which is great. So, we've got Dennis, travelled a long way, Tenant Farmers Association from Wales. We've got Creighton from Afonydd, Cymru, Rivers Trust. Dave Ashworth, Welsh Government, supporting the Sustainable Food Systems change. Tyler, also from Welsh Government, senior researcher on the Food Bill, working with Peter Fox on that, and we'll hear more from Dave. We've got Jerry Langford from Coed Cymru, and then we've got Dav Letellier, is it? Letellier, from NRW, Sustainable Management System, Sustainable Land Reform element. So it'll be a challenge for us all to get our points across. And if Patrick joins us, Patrick Holden, Sustainable Food Trust as well, might be joining us as well. So I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Dave to give us an overview of Sustainable Farming Scheme. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hello everyone, good afternoon. So my name's Dave Ashford from the Welsh Government Land Management Reform Team. I think we should start by mentioning, obviously there's been a huge amount of disruption to food and farming over the last couple of years. Brexit, COVID, some very noisy politics at the moment, war in Ukraine, obviously. But whereas I don't think it's my position as a Welsh Government civil servant to kind of comment on those factors, I think we just have to acknowledge that these hugely impactful events are going on. But from a Welsh Government's perspective, we have been quite clear that the need to support the production of sustainable food and to mitigate the climate and nature emergencies, those needs haven't gone away, despite everything else that's going on in current affairs at the moment. So it's with that in mind that we produced the scheme outline for the Sustainable Farming Scheme back in July. I should add that these are still proposals. None of these decisions are set in stone yet. They are still proposals. But what we've been doing throughout this summer is trying to raise awareness and to socialise these proposals with as many people as possible, to bring as many people along as part of the conversation as possible. I can't go into an awful lot of detail in the proposals now. I've got 10 minutes just over, so if I was to go through everything, we'd be here till breakfast. But I will just mention a few things just to give you a flavour of what's been included in the proposals. First of all, we've proposed a whole series of activities that farmers can get involved with going forwards, and we've separated those activities into 3 layers, a universal layer, an optional layer, and a collaborative layer. The universal layer is about 12 or 13 actions that we believe should be within reach of most farmers across Wales, and delivery of those universal actions would be in exchange for a baseline payment. So that will be a big change in itself from the current arrangements that most farmers are involved with. Those actions have been, well, they're covering a range of things. For example, the first one that's listed in the proposals is benchmarking. So business benchmarking. That will mean different things to different farmers in different sectors. But for example, it might mean, for example, farmers monitoring themselves on the numbers of lambs reared or the numbers of ewe mortality, for example, or herd replacement. And by comparing themselves across the sector, hopefully then that will give farmers an idea of where they're operating possibly slightly lower than average, and therefore where there is room for improvement. Now, the most important part of that aspect will be providing that information in a way that the farmer is able to use to make more informed decisions. So we don't have all the answers yet as to how that will happen, but this is part of the process that we're now in, trying to involve as many people as possible to harvest all those ideas together and all the kind of good and bad experiences, and try and put in place a system that enables us to do that. Something else we've put in there, for example, is a universal action to kind of do more soil testing across our farms. Now, it's not to turn everybody organic. It's not to say that we wouldn't allow fertiliser in future. It's not that at all. But by having more informed soil data, and let's face it, soil is where it all begins. If we're talking carbon, if we're talking biodiversity, if we're talking food production, anything, soil is where it all begins, isn't it? So by having a more informed range of soil data across Wales, then the individual farmers can then make more informed decisions in terms of more targeted applications, or even if it's identifying that kind of fertiliser is not the issue that's missing at all. Maybe it's pH, maybe it's trace elements, maybe it's different things, soil compaction, for example, or anything else. So by having that more kind of detailed knowledge of soils, that the individual farmer can make kind of more informed choices. And then we as a government level, we can aggregate that data up and really understand what state our soils are in across Wales. We've got other activities in there, for example, in terms of boosting biosecurity to improve animal health and welfare on farms. And we've got proposals in there for improving the condition and the extent of habitats and woodlands across Wales. So I do have to talk about trees. It's been the most conventional. It's been the most controversial issue since we raised these proposals back in the summer. So if you're not familiar, one of the universal actions that we've proposed is that as 10% of each farm to be under trees or woodland or tree cover of some sort or another, be it agroforestry or individual trees or woodland. Now that in itself has, like I said, it's caused quite some anxiety, and we are perfectly aware of the anxiety that it's caused. We're just trying to work our way through those issues at the moment in a way that means that we can try and integrate more trees onto farmland in a way that those trees become an asset, not a hindrance. So on the smaller scale, that might mean more shelter belts or biosecurity buffers on the edges of farms. On the larger scale, that might mean opportunity for diversifying into a longer-term timber crop. All sorts of opportunities there, but we realise as well there are all sorts of challenges in making that happen. So that's why it's why I'm in rooms like this, trying to have the conversation with as many people as possible. But like I said, we are trying to involve as many farmers as possible in this conversation, to try and bring together everyone's ideas, positive and negative experiences, and in a way that tries to make that work. I should say it's not because we love trees. Part of this discussion today is about the kind of the challenges facing farming and food. One of the elements, I think, we talk about climate change, but I think we sort of don't really acknowledge what impacts climate change is having on us. We're in drought at the moment, and we can expect to see more flood and more drought in Wales over the coming decades. The academic consensus is that over the next, the coming decades, maybe our average rainfall in Wales will stay about the same, but in much more seasonal patterns. So a lot more winter flooding, a lot more dry, droughty summers, and that obviously in itself then will have huge implications for food production, for farming. Of course, I do understand that we could plant every square inch of Wales in trees and we wouldn't make a dent on global warming on a planetary scale. But we can make our contribution, and of course what we can do is try and use those trees in a way that not only lock up extra carbon, but help mitigate the risks themselves. So where could we plant those trees that would be most beneficial, like I said, as shelter belts on farms in terms of kind of prevailing weather or kind of hot sun and to reduce heat stress with animals, or as more intact networks of trees and habitats to absorb more water in the landscape and kind of disrupt those flow patterns during heavy rainfall periods. So yes, lots more activities in there as well. Like I said, I can't go into them all in detail. We've got more optional activities based on food diversification. So I think often when diversification is mentioned, people imagine kind of barn conversions and wind turbines. We very much want to talk about food diversification. So where are there opportunities for more horticulture in Wales? Where are there opportunities for adding value into our current sectors? So not every dairy farmer can make their own cheese. I wish Patrick was here, he'd be a great example for us. Not every beef and sheep farmer can start making their own meat pies, obviously, but where there are opportunities, where do we try and bring some of those things to life to realise some of that extra value added and extra profit closer to the communities where this produce comes from? As was mentioned at the beginning of this, and I think was on the poster for this event, water scarcity. Like I said, we can expect to see more hot, droughty summers in future. What does that mean for agriculture and food production? If we are to see an increase in the horticultural sector in Wales, what does that mean for water supplies and irrigation? So something else we've got in these proposals is extra water harvesting, be it on a smaller scale with kind of infrastructure in the yard or on a larger scale with kind of lagoons on farmland, if that were possible. We have also talked about using native breeds or boosting native breeds, so more resilient livestock to cope with more extreme conditions, for example, where that is suitable. Like I said, lots of things in there. I can't go into much more detail at the moment. We do know that we haven't got all the answers. We don't have all the ideas, and we certainly don't have all the answers. Like I said, that's why we're trying to encourage as many people as possible to be part of that conversation. One of the messages I'm trying to get across is that this isn't an environmental scheme that we're talking about. I think often things are badged as environmental or as food production. Of course, separating those things is impossible. Food production and farming happens within the environment. So all of these actions that we're talking about, they are designed to help the farmer be more aware of their margins, to cut costs, to be more cost effective with kind of inputs and things like that. Also using things like more robust woodlands, trees in the landscapes, more robust habitats to help take the edge off some of those risks of flood and drought, for example. So all of those things together should be regarded as a suite of things designed to make farm businesses become more resilient and prosperous in the context of all the other disruptions, as I mentioned at the very beginning, rising costs, etc., etc. What we are trying to do is get as many farmers to take part. So any farmers in the room, I don't know how many farmers we have in the room, but any farmers who are in the room or anyone's got the ear of any farmers, one thing I would definitely ask you to do, please, is that we're running a co-design survey at the moment. I think historically we'd have designed a scheme or a piece of policy and we'd have said, here you are farmers, here it is. We are very much trying to do the opposite to that at the moment and trying to incorporate all of your ideas, all of your experience. So as an individual farmer, the most valuable thing you can do at the moment, please, is to take part in our co-design survey. And I can go into more details about that later. But please go away and think that there is a co-design survey that you can take part in that will directly boost our evidence to develop this policy as we go forwards. I should mention the Agriculture Bill. So just a few weeks ago, the Minister for Rural Affairs, Lesley Griffiths, introduced the first ever Agriculture Wales Bill to the Senedd. I can't really get into the detail of that in terms of debating the content. So now that it belongs to the Senedd, formal scrutiny and amendments, etc., that process belongs to the Senedd. So as a civil servant, it's not appropriate for me to get involved in that conversation. But again, a hugely exciting opportunity for Wales to have our first agriculture bill setting our own legislation. And that legislation itself will underpin the sustainable farming scheme that I've just been talking about. I didn't time myself exactly, but I think that's about the 10-minute mark. Lots in there, Gary. I'm sure there'll be, from the audience and from my co-panelists, there'll be lots of discussions. Hopefully things have just triggered. But I think I shall leave it there for the moment, if that's okay.
Thank you, David. I think the only thing I'll add in to Dave's sort of précis of that large process that's been going on. Currently, there's also a general consultation open on the Sustainable Farming Scheme, and you've got a week or two left to respond, and I'd encourage any of you that have the ability to work through the document. There's specific questions. You don't have to answer them all, but the more we answer and the more that we either challenge, support, it'll give Dave and his team an idea of where we think we're heading to. We know the trajectory that the Sustainable Farming Scheme has moved to over the last 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. But it'd be great to sort of reinforce that that's where we're heading to, because you could look across the border and argue that Elms set off on a good journey, but actually is teetering now, in my personal opinion, to a bit of an abyss, really, and could just be wiped off, which would be a great shame. And in terms of the Ag Bill, there's also a consultation running through the Scrutiny Committee at the moment. I know Rhys is here from Nature Friendly Farming. Have you presented to the Scrutiny Committee or about to? Next week. There we go. So that process is ongoing as well, and there is a consultation open till mid-November on the agricultural, just the very overarching elements of the agriculture bill. So just encouraging you all to have a look, respond where you think you can, but don't feel you have to wade through every single question. They'll all be looked at. Thank you.
Sorry, Gary, can I have 2 points that you've just
Very
triggered in me?
quickly.
Very quickly, 2 points. Gary himself just mentioned that the closing deadline is coming in a few weeks' time. I've just extended it. It was the 31st of October. Nobody else knows this yet because I only got the agreement yesterday. I'm just extending it to the 21st of November, so a few extra weeks there to incorporate more participation. And one of the things I should have said, given that you've just mentioned Elm yourself, being very mindful of where we are geographically, we've got I think it's about 450, 500 farm businesses that straddle the England-Wales border. And they've not been forgotten about at all. But obviously, as kind of policies diverge, these farms are going to find themselves possibly split down the middle. So one thing I am doing at the moment, as much as we've got these proposals, we have to look very carefully at how they impact on those specific farmers. And that's another task I've got ongoing. So I'd just like to say that this group of farmers have not been forgotten about.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move on to Tyler to present Food Bill Wales to us, and then I'm going to take questions from the panellists first and then open it up for that bit of audience participation. So over to you, Tyler.
Diolch, Gary. And just to introduce myself, I'm Tyler Walsh, Senior Researcher to Peter Fox, the Member of the Senedd for Monmouth, Shadow Minister for Finance in the Senedd. So just to give a bit of context, every now and again, members of the Senedd are able to put forward proposals for legislation, open just for opposition members, so it's not members of the government, and it's sort of, if I were a minister, what piece of legislation, what law would I put in place? So Peter, as well as a member of the Senedd, is also a farmer, a beef farmer in Monmouthshire, so he's very, very keen to, ensure that we have sustainable local produce used within our communities. And as has been mentioned, we all saw during the COVID crisis about the fragility of the supply chains, the impacts that we had on the disruption that was caused by the pandemic, and that's been a bit of a recurring theme since the pandemic. So Peter was sort of very keen on designing a bill to help ensure that we get more local produce into our communities and to consider how we use food. So the food bill is not necessarily about production. That's what the Sustainable Land Management Scheme will do. That's what the Agriculture Bill will do. But Peter's idea is how we sort of bring this whole sphere together. We've seen a lot of developments currently, as Dave mentioned. We've got various pieces of legislation. So how do we bring all of this together into one coherent whole? And so this is what the food bill is about. It's sort of providing a framework for a more coherent, consistent, and strategic cross-governmental approach to food policy and practice. And this is across the entire food system. We hear that phrase of from farm to fork, and it's exactly what Peter really wants to look at. Because what we've heard, and I know there's quite a few people here that myself and Peter have spoken to during this process, is that actually, we're not where we need to be in terms of joining up the dots and ensuring the policy is all driving us in one direction. We have bits of good policy, bits of good practice right across the country, but it's how we ensure that this is something which happens regularly, that this is the norm, not just the exception to the rule. So these are the principles which the bill has been developed within. Now, you can have a look at the bill on the Senedd website, and more than happy if you email Peter Fox, that's peter.fox@senedd.wales. Be more than happy to send you further information about the bill. There's quite a lengthy consultation document online as well, which I know Gary and a few others had the delight to read through a few weeks ago. But just really quickly, one of the key mechanisms towards, doing this is establishing food goals. So these are based on the well-being goals in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is, quite an accepted sort of progressive piece of legislation. It's a marker that, we think a bit more broadly, a bit more widely about policy. So the food goals are very much based on the well-being goals. So we have the primary food goal, which is, to promote the provision of affordable, healthy, economically, environmentally and socially responsible and sustainable food for the people of Wales. Now, quite a lofty ambition, and we are not pretending that this bill has the answers. It doesn't. It's a framework bill to ensure that the system is in place, there's a legislative framework in place, so we can start thinking about food in a different way, which I think we're getting towards, and things like Sustainable Land Management Scheme is getting us towards. But, it's well and good ensuring that we, we produce food in a sustainable way, but where are the markets? How do we get this into local areas? And that's kind of what we're thinking about. So underneath the primary food goal, there are secondary food goals. Now, this doesn't mean that they're less important. It's just these are sort of the building blocks of the primary food goal. So we've got sort of economic well-being, health and social, education, environment and biodiversity, things that we feel help to sort of drive us towards achieving this overarching aim that we have within the bill. And so what we will be doing is ensuring that these would be monitored, the progress being made is monitored, and that the Welsh Government would have to come up with sort of targets towards achieving some of these goals, and I would also incorporate existing targets as well within the various strategies that already exist. So how are we ensuring that sort of public bodies work towards these goals? So first of all, there was a requirement on Welsh Government to produce a national food strategy for Wales. Now, we've got various different plans at the moment, which are all great. But again, what's been brought to Peter and myself is that these don't necessarily always talk to each other, that if you look through the ideas in one strategy, doesn't always line up with the ideas in another strategy. And this is not a criticism of Welsh Government, it's a criticism of all governments. We see strategies, they're put on a shelf somewhere, a few years later we see, another strategy. It's just how we actually ensure that these are active documents doing something, not just talked about and then refreshed every couple of years. So the National Food Strategy then would look at how we bring all of this together, how we look at the entire food system and ensure that the Welsh Government is focused on these policies. Then you'd have local food plans sitting underneath these. These would be by public bodies such as councils. And these have been ensuring that councils are also contributing to these goals as well through sort of more bottom-up initiatives and creating the local conditions for more community-based activities to create opportunities for local producers. For example, you have the new Universal Free School Meal Policy, a fantastic policy. Why can't we have local producers helping to put to put good quality, sustainable, healthy food into schools. It's joining up these dots which sometimes aren't quite created for various reasons. And we've often heard, I think it's Caerphilly Council, I think it is, a very good driver in terms of local procurement. And a lot of councils use Caerphilly as sort of the gold standard. But, we've got 22 local authorities. So how do we create 22 Caerphillys? So it's about joining those dots together. And then Gary mentioned the Welsh Food Commission. And we've taken this idea and we've also put this into the bill as well. So this would be the main sort of way that we're going to bring everything together and actually ensure public bodies are actually doing the things that they need to be doing. Because currently, councils, government, there's so many things going on at the moment. The past couple of years have just been a whirlwind of problem after problem after problem. So, we can't blame officials, we can't blame ministers, council leaders from, taking their eye off the ball on some of these things, because it's been very much a reactive couple of years. But, how do we be proactive? How do we actually, go, okay, here are some of the issues that we've seen over the past couple of years. What can we put into place to actually, mitigate some of these as we go into the future, to create more resilient communities. So the Food Commission is meant to be sort of a more critical friend. It's not another layer of bureaucracy. It's not a red tape, to use that phrase. It's to help ministers, help public bodies sort of understand what they can do to sort of improve where we are now. And the intention would be that the Food Commission would be made up of people from the entire food sector, people who know this stuff, experts in their field, and then would help, to be critically analyse how we are delivering on some of these things, but also to help in the delivery of some of these things as well. Because we've got fantastic ideas, and me and Peter, have been really fortunate to meet with a lot of people, and a lot of people who are here today, who have some fantastic ideas, and it's just actually putting these now in place, because we've seen some fantastic local community initiatives. We were on a farm in Monmouth about 2 weeks ago now, an organic farm, and it was fantastic to see, and the ideas that particular farmer had was great. It's just how we translate that, and help push some of those ideas up further into the policy making process. So, like I said, this is a really whistle-stop tour of the bill, and if you do want any more information, do get in touch with us. We'd be more than happy to share the information then to answer any questions that you may have. So where we're at now is we have a draft bill which we've been consulting on over the summer. This bill then will be formally laid to the Senedd in December. So the statement will be made, I believe it's the 16th of December, so it's the third Wednesday of December, in which Peter will formally lay the bill to the Senedd, and then this will start its scrutiny process then. So much like the Agri Bill, it will then start going through the committees, into the debates, etc. So the issue that we've got at the minute, like I said, Peter's an opposition member, so it's not necessarily a Welsh government-driven bill. So we are in a very peculiar position where we're drafting a bill for ministers, but it's, ministers obviously have some particular ideas about what we're proposing. So our challenge is to ensure that the Welsh Government is fully on board with this bill, and trying to promote what this bill will do and will help to achieve. So we're in a very peculiar position, and it's an interesting challenge, but it's one that Peter, myself, and the bill team that we've got behind us are all really working towards achieving. And I think we'll have a very interesting few months in front of the Senedd committees as well. So I think that's hopefully a summary of where we are. But again, we are very much looking forward to working with the ministers, other members of the Senedd, yourselves here in this room now to hopefully take some of these ideas forward and translate that into policy outcomes then in the future.
Thank you, Tyler. Two fairly major emerging policies coming out of Welsh Government there, and Tyler didn't mention it, but the private members bill, I believe, is the second only ever private members bill to go through the Senedd, so it's a learning process for Welsh Government as well on this one, and we're just keen to give it all the support we can. We've looked at what Scotland have done and the issues they've had, perhaps in introducing their food bill and how they're phasing it and how they're learning from that process. So, yes, a good cross-country learning as well. I just wanted to take 2 seconds to try and give you a flavour of some of the other world of food policy that's going on out there. And I'll be honest and say I don't think I've ever seen a busier time in terms of food policy within a government. So I'm just going to rattle off a few really quickly. Community food strategy is about to emerge from Welsh Government. Be interesting to see what that looks like. NVZs, clearly hot topic, and particularly, as we've mentioned, in Powys and for our rivers in Wales. Phosphate regulations. I heard only the other week there is to be a public sector food strategy within Welsh Government. It's interesting. I also heard there was going to be a public sector food programme within Welsh Government. That's interesting as well. We've got a food and environment consultation that's just been completed, so it'll be interesting to see what's come out of that. But we've also got existing policy that's already out there. Clean Air Bill, Environment Act, Net Zero, carbon targets, Future Generations Act, all of those play their part within these emerging policies. And I think that's why FPAC, particularly Food Policy Alliance Cymru, are pushing for some really joined up thinking. Let's get somebody in place that looks across the whole of our system, because food applies to all of us, we know that. But it's currently perhaps delivered in silos that sometimes compete against each other. Okay, I'm going to hand over to our panellists, and I should introduce Patrick Holden to the panel as well. Patrick Holden, Sustainable Food Trust, I would say a West Wales farmer, but he's on the coast, which is a privileged place to be, perhaps, when you're trying to grow veg particularly, but also doing beef, all sorts of other things as well down there. So we've got sort of 10 minutes, quarter of an hour questions from the panel, particularly to Dave and to Tyler on either sustainable food systems or food bill. Fire away. Dennis?
Yes. Is this machine working?
Should do.
Good, good. Thank you for inviting Tenant Farmers Association to be with such an erudite panel. Very pleased, thank you. Yes, tenant farmers. About 30% of Wales is farmed by someone other than the owner, and about a quarter of the 24,000 farmers are tenants or graziers, and about half the tenants are farm business tenancies, which figures published last month, average length 3 years, 87% less than 5 years. If the sustainable farming scheme doesn't work for tenants, it won't work at all. That's a statement from the Minister on several occasions. At the moment, I'm sorry to say, it does not work for tenants. Why? For some tenants, it'll be almost impossible to access the scheme as it stands because of the recently introduced pollution regulations, which quite a lot of tenants will not be able to comply with due to barriers in their tenancy agreements. And secondly, the 10% tree planting target. To take the first one, is the landlord going to spend £50,000 on a new slurry store if the tenancy is going to end in 2 years? No. Is the tenant going to spend it? No. Is the bank going to lend money? No. So what do? Does the tenant on a farm business tenancy who's got a slurry store which is non-compliant, does he break the pollution regulations and get fined? Does he break the tenancy agreement and lose his tenancy, or what? So that's the first thing, and that's a mandatory requirement of the new scheme. You have to comply with the regulation, quite rightly so, but that's got to be sorted out. The second thing is All tenancies have the same thing, which the land can only be used for agricultural production, as defined by the 1947 Act, rearing livestock, growing crops, or trees if it's ancillary to the main business. That is a very small type of agroforestry, not all. So a tenant cannot plant trees, so if he hasn't got 10%, what is he going to do? Trees already on the tenancy belong to the landlord, all of them. Therefore, any payments that might be coming for, say, carbon capture would go to the landlord. If a tenant was lucky enough to get permission, at the end of the tenancy, the trees revert to the landlord and he would get any payment. So, a lot of tenants won't enter the scheme. If they do enter the scheme, there's a lot of the options which he will not be able to do because they're not agricultural in definition. Therefore, he's being hit from all ways, isn't he? So,
Okay, there's a
it does not work for tenants.
couple
Time
of
up.
key questions there, and I think I'll ask Dave to raise those ones.
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, to reiterate what Dennis said at the beginning of that if this proposed scheme doesn't work for tenancy, then it just doesn't work at all. And I think we would all agree with that. What the Minister has committed to is that the proposals, the Sustainable Farming Scheme proposals as they currently stand, one of my ongoing tasks is to bring together some kind of groups of experts and work out how these proposals will fit, or indeed how they need to be adapted to suit farmers in different scenarios. So the different scenarios, I mentioned cross-border farms a while ago when I was speaking, so that's one of the scenarios. Young and new entrants, common land graziers, for example. But the most important, and I'm sure me and Dennis would be in agreement on this, the most important of those groups of farmers are tenant farmers. So what we do need to do, what we are doing, is pulling together this group to scrutinise the SFS proposals. Where do we need to introduce some flexibility? Where do we need to come up with some alternatives? We know with the tree planting thing that we've got lots of challenges to the tree planting proposal. There's all sorts of places where ecologically you wouldn't want to plant trees anyway, but we do know, of course, that with tenant farmers that they would struggle on that. So do we need to come up with an alternative? Do we need to bring in some flexibility? Also, the duration of the contract, we've proposed 5-year rolling contracts. And again, if that doesn't work for tenancy, we need to come up with an alternative to that, some flexibility around that. I don't have all the answers to that yet, which is why I keep saying we need to kind of bringing people into the conversation. So yes, lots of questions. We don't have all the answers. We need to work together to deliver them.
Thank you. Good questions. I think one point I'll perhaps say on that, Dennis, is the way that I've read the current documentation is it should be the active land manager that benefits from the system, not the landlord or large farm owning estate holders, because those are the people working really hard on the ground, doing the job, striving to make a living, and therefore we've got to reward them and support them to do this. It's going to be a challenge to make sure that works within the legislation, within their frameworks of their tenancy agreements and the farm business tenancies and all that sort of stuff. But I think the principle is there that the support scheme should benefit those actively managing the land on the ground.
Just as active land manager, not active farmer. That's the
Okay,
crucial thing.
that's a good bit of wording to feedback. Thank you for that. Any other questions from the panel? Jerry.
Yeah, if I could ask both of you, what's the definition of sustainable farming or sustainable land management? Because certainly in the environmental sector, we think that definition, the precision of that definition is crucial. And how do you achieve the balance between the different aspects of sustainability?
Shall I go first? This is something we've been challenged on quite a bit, just even in the last few days, to be honest. The agriculture bill that was laid just a few weeks ago, I am not an expert in the content of it at all, but I don't think, even though that the bill itself uses sustainable, it embeds sustainable land management as the overarching kind of well, overarching, underpinning, whatever, as the fundamental principle, I don't think we've actually defined sustainable land management within the bill. In the development of it, we've been using the UN's definition, which I can't recite off the top of my head, but certainly it covers, when we talk about sustainability, we talk about, we certainly mean the economic, the environmental, the social, and the cultural aspects. So all of those have been considered as we're developing these proposals. Like I said, the proposals aren't nailed down yet. The bill itself still has a long way to go before that becomes an act. So I'm certain that kind of scrutiny over how those kind of different elements will be kind of balanced out, how various indicators and targets will be set, that will be some work for the kind of the coming months through the kind of the scrutiny processes that Tyler's mentioned with the Senedd. So we have an understanding that they need to be balanced out. The actual mechanisms of that are being worked through.
Thank you. Tyler?
I'll say quite a similar response actually to Dave. I think we've had to be careful with how we define things within the bill. Like I said, because we are designing a bill for ministers to then, look at working, we didn't want to sort of use our sort of ideas of what concepts mean and give ministers more leeway to go, actually, we disagree with this, so that means the whole bill is going to fall later down the line. So we've had to sort of really balance the fine line between what we think and actually what's on the face of the bill. So for us, a lot of the work will be done within the explanatory memorandum, which is just basically, fleshing out what the bill does, what the policy intentions are, what are the policy outcomes. So a lot of that detail will be explored actually quite in depth within the explanatory memorandum, where we can discuss some of these themes. But within the actual bill itself, we don't have a specific sort of, for sustainability, see this, for sustainable farming, this is what it is. But what we do is make linkages to existing legislation, which is the best way of, that we think, of taking our bill forward. So we make linkages with the Environment Wales Act. We make linkages with the, as I mentioned, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and link there to the sort of wellbeing goals, which I think have a lot of good things within it about sustainability, about using our natural resources. And we also, as well, as Dave said, sort of link to particular UN declarations, and we've based that around what was mentioned within the Scottish Good Food Bill. So we've sort of lent from existing pieces of legislation to give us a more solid sort of way forward. And again, this is not a solid bill when it goes to the Senedd. As Dave said with the Agri Bill, we'll listen to ideas, we'll be challenged on particular elements of the bill, and if there are things that we need to strengthen, we'll look at doing that. But in short, we've looked at sort of the existing legislation and used that basis then to take our bill forward as a start, but we'll be fleshing out a lot more of ideas within the explanatory memorandum, which will be drafted alongside the bill, and really explain our intentions behind the words within the bill.
Thank you. Jerry, dare I ask if you're content with those answers?
Well, yes, I think it's the definition. I think is important, so it is good that it will be discussed at length. Yeah. And I think the really important thing is you don't end up focusing on one outcome at the expense of others, because as the principle behind the Wellbeing Future Generations Act is that they have to be in balance, and you can't trade off one against the other, and be looking for the sort of that to be deeply embedded.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take two more questions from the panel, and then I really do want to open it up to the audience to participate as well. Patrick had his hand up, and then I'll come to you, Creighton.
Thank you. I'd like to build on the question of defining sustainability. Apologies for being late. and particularly because I didn't hear what you said, Dave, but because my question is going to be sort of related to what I imagine you might have said and what you've just said. I think defining sustainability is critical, and we produced a report, this report, Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, which is a kind of modelling exercise based on transitioning the whole of the UK, including Wales, of course, to sustainable farming. And we fudged the question of whether it was called sustainable, regenerative, agroecological, organic, or biodynamic, because all those words are being used. Instead, we thought, let's get some principles. So we've set out the principles in this document, and we would suggest that the Welsh Government should do the same, because the UN definition is pretty toothless, if we're honest. That won't do the job. And I think we have to talk about minimising the use of non-renewable external inputs, addressing the climate change challenge and restoring biodiversity, and that means farming in harmony with nature. And it also means, I think, obeying the principles of the circular economy. We've set those principles out. And if you apply those principles in the practice of an agricultural system, you get a pretty strong definition which emerges from the principles. And frankly, I would say that largely rules out the use of nitrogen fertiliser. And I think that's important, because there's a lot of talk about Wales being a green farmed land, but in fact, the biodiversity on most Welsh grassland where nitrogen is used is very poor. And so it really matters to get this definition right. And the fallback, I think, which is also a question to you, Dave, is how will you measure? Because if you're not going to define the system, then at least you can measure the impacts. And I know this is in your discussion, but I would urge everyone here to really put the most pressure you possibly can on the Welsh Government to measure the impacts of the sustainable farming scheme, because then it's transparent. And if the scheme is not good enough, we'll see, because and not just measuring the impacts using a framework that the Welsh Government introduces, that a framework which is used comprehensively, not just in the UK, but all over the world, because then we in Wales can claim to be contributing towards net zero, towards addressing climate change, but also other factors. So it needs to be measured, and measured holistically. And I know you've been doing some trials with our global farm metric, but I'd love to hear what your thinking is, first of all, about better principles than the UN principles, and secondly, whether there will be a government commitment to require all farmers entering the sustainable farming scheme to measure from the start as a condition for entry.
I'll pass to you, Dave.
Quite a lot in there, and I don't have the answers to all of it. As I've said a couple of times, well, this is a developing piece of policy. So, and for those reasons, I don't have all the answers. To respond to a few of the things that Patrick's just said, we do have it's our internal process, but as Patrick's already said, that it needs to be kind of external and transparent and scrutinised. But to begin with, at least, we do have an internal process where we are doing a lot of modelling and monitoring. So combining all of the impacts of soils, of flood, of water, of weather, of habitats, of biodiversity, of and several other parameters that I can't think of right at the moment. We are using that to model how these ongoing developments will work. They work together to refine our proposals going forwards. I absolutely agree that things need to be measured and monitored going forwards. So that process as well will be our kind of first stop for ensuring that the scheme itself is working. I mean, whether the individual farm contract is working or not, that can be measured by working with the farmer, and I'll come back to that in a second. But of course, we need to know that the scheme itself is working on a national level to ensure that we're getting value for money for the taxpayer, and that we are in fact achieving all of these things. Patrick's just said an internal system won't be good enough. It needs to be kind of more transparent to be scrutinised. Again, this is a developing space, so I take Patrick's recommendations on board for that. And again, we need to kind of work on that going forwards. Another point that Patrick raised then was that to ensure that we are developing on a farm-by-farm basis, we have proposed, not the first or last time I've used the word proposed today, but we have proposed that on entry into the Future Sustainable Farming Scheme, that there will need to be some element of carbon audit, also a biodiversity audit as well. Now, the administrative pressure on us is to make sure that that's meaningful, but as efficient and cost-effective as possible. So how that exactly will work has got to be developed. But we do appreciate that in terms of achieving the scheme objectives, that we need to be looking at things like fuel use, energy, carbon sequestration, soil condition. So I think all of those elements have to be considered as part of this kind of appraisal process. Patrick's desperate to come back in.
Well, just to say, one way you could achieve it would be to use the existing certifiers and auditors which are already on our farm. We just did our red tractor and organic inspection the day before yesterday. It really caused us to lose the will to live, and I helped design the organic inspection. and it's not fit. They're not fit for purpose at the moment. If the Welsh Government was to say to the existing certifiers, we'll contract you to do the work, but don't certify, audit the farm 5 times, which is the number of audits we have a year, have one and cover them all off, giving data that you can then use to assess whether the scheme is working. And do include social and cultural impacts. They're really important.
Yeah, I think I'll come back in briefly on that one. That's certainly written into the current documentation about using existing schemes that already monitor farms, not putting additional pressure, and I think that's been lobbied quite hard throughout. We know farmers don't want to be filling in forms, they want to be out producing crops. I'm going to move on, if I may, because otherwise we're going to have less time. Yep.
Yeah, moving on from that, there is mention in the document about farm assurance schemes being used as part of the monitoring process, if you like. Are you concerned about the quality of monitoring and the effectiveness of farm assurance schemes so far? I mention in particular Red Tractor. Red Tractor, the highest percentage of any sector in Red Tractor in Wales is dairy. Yet dairy is the one area of farming where you have the highest number of pollution incidents. Red Tractor were heavily involved in the Axe catchment in Devon, and I think it was 92 farms were inspected by the Environment Agency down in Devon. I think 86 of them were non-regulation compliant and 42 were currently polluting when those inspections took place. Every one of those farms that wasn't compliant was a Red Tractor farm. What steps would you take to make sure that monitoring by farm assurance schemes is effective, bearing in mind the obvious link with the industry itself and the fact that the people who actually appoint the inspectors are the first purchaser of the product itself in relation to milk?
Okay, I'm by no means an expert on the Red Tractor certification process, so I can't go into any detail. But in terms of the principles within the proposals, we have said that where there's existing assurance schemes, maybe we need to caveat that by where there's existing assurance schemes that are strong enough or robust enough. Maybe is the wording that we need to use. But certainly where there is an existing scheme that is robust enough, as has just been referred to, again, how do we, rather than making the farmer go through the hoops of doing those processes twice, how do we do it once and then use that data as smartly as possible? I'm sure going forward, as data and as kind of online digital systems have developed over the last years, we probably couldn't have had this conversation 20 years ago, but we can certainly have this conversation today. So in terms of being smart about data capture, that is certainly an area that we need to look into. In terms of your specific Red Tractor concerns, Creighton, like I said, I'm no expert, but I feel that, and it's a question I'll take back to my policy colleagues, is surely that needs to be where those assurance mechanisms themselves are robust enough. And if they aren't...
I mentioned Red Tractor because I have information on Red Tractor.
Okay.
My concern is about farm assurance schemes generally, and that Welsh Government have the means of looking at them and deciding whether they are robust enough. And it might, I'm not just saying don't use them, what I'm saying is it might be an opportunity to strengthen the farm assurance scheme so they can do their job better.
I mean, certainly, and I take that, you know, the opportunity to kind of bolster them. Certainly when I've looked superficially at some of the kind of assurance schemes, I think there's lots of wording like supportive of and encouraging X, or, you know, encouraging Y, but whether there's any actual teeth in those mechanisms if the individual, you know, is not delivering those things. So no, so I take your point on board. Is there an opportunity for increasing the robustness of these systems? I need to take that back and have those conversations.
It's a fantastic opportunity. Wales could lead the world in this if we get this integrated approach, and the Welsh Government strengthen the existing audits to make sure that they're delivering the public goods.
Thank you. I'm going to draw the sort of panel questions to a close there. I assume, perhaps rightly or wrongly, that we might have a roaming microphone, but if you're confident in your voice, please just shout out. But if you've got a question to raise your hand and somebody will try and either race over to you with a microphone, or I'm going to take the chap at the back there. If you're confident in your voice, please go ahead.
That's right, I'll give it a go. We talked about food security and food scarcity and food policy. As a farmer, could any of the panel give me a good reason why I should bother producing a surplus that's at risk of a financial loss?
Just define that a little bit more. So
I don't have to feed anyone.
No.
If it doesn't make money. So you talk a lot about food policy and food security. Give me what are the reasons why I should be producing at current market conditions if it's at a financial loss? Because as a farmer, I could just feed ourselves and do nothing else for the land, couldn't I?
Yep, I'm going to look to somebody to try and give you a response to that one, but I think it's...
Because it's all, a policymaker has a job while you're on something policy over. Whereas if I decide to produce, if I decide just to produce for maybe my family and my friends, and then the rest of the farm becomes my playground, then can you give me a good reason why I should carry on producing when the financial position isn't that good?
Patrick's got his hand up.
Yeah.
I think the question is right on the money, because in the end, farmers need to be profitable to produce food in a sustainable way. And it seems to me the exam question for the Welsh Government is, will the combination of measures, both the carrots and the sticks, which are introduced in the sustainable farming scheme, shift the balance of financial advantage to producing food in a sustainable way? And if you can't achieve that, and there are plenty of reasons at the moment why it might be very challenging, then we have to look at the other things which can be brought to bear to shift the advantage so that farmers throughout Wales can produce food in a sustainable way and make more money, if they're making any money, from the way they're farming at the moment. And that really is it's the beginning and the end of it. It is about the money.
I'll just offer you the chance to come back in. Does that give you any hint of a reply?
I suppose at the end of the day, if the land is in our control, then it's up to me, isn't it? So if I want to be profitable and have quality of life, then I will decide what I do. It's not my responsibility who starves, and it's not my responsibility who goes hungry, but it is my responsibility to provide for, to look after the land and to provide for my family. So what I'm saying is that if what we're doing isn't profitable and enjoyable, then why should we do it?
Yep, I think that's generally a fair question.
Simple question, because it goes way past talking about the details of policy and what we can and cannot do. The basics are, if it's not profitable, I'm not interested.
Yeah, and I would perhaps argue, not really on behalf of Welsh Government, but what they're trying to do with the schemes is to enable farmers to survive in terms of financial economics, but only support the ones that are willing to transition into that more environmental sphere. That doesn't stop any farmer from being commercially viable if they can and produce food at whatever means they feel they need to, so not necessarily having to change anything. If their business is profitable and they don't need to rely on support from government, then carry on. There is that option, as you suggest, to shrink back to just, I'm going to look after my family and my immediate surroundings, etc., and I won't join the scheme, and my land will perhaps do its own thing to a degree. But yeah, I guess you've all got personal choice in which way you go. Hopefully the scheme is an incentive enough to move into that sort of transition period, I would argue. But we have to wait and see what it looks like. Sorry,
Can I just make a comment to the back of that? So I've never had the question that way around before, which is why I was a little bit kind of stunned, but it is an excellently put question, and I need to properly put together an answer for it. But in terms of the money, the profitability, I've talked about all the proposals, and the one thing I didn't talk about at all was money. The proposals we put out this summer, if you've looked at them, there is no payment attached to any of it, for good reasons. Whilst they are still the most detailed set of proposals that we've published to date over the last couple of years, they are still somewhat high level. So until we have all of the details to go with those actions, then we haven't been able to kind of like to put payments to them. There's people working on payments behind the scenes, of course, but until those kind of actions are detailed towards a bit more of a finalised state, it's not possible it's not possible to put payments towards them. That's on the scheme level. Of course, there's a separate question, which is the more political question, was that as much as this is Welsh Government developing a proposal for Wales and to match Welsh priorities, the budget itself still comes from UK Government. This is a political issue, it's not a civil service issue, but on a political level, our ministers are still fighting for that long-term clarity of budgets going forward, which we don't have yet. I realise that without money attached to these proposals, it's only half a conversation, but there's a legitimate reason why the payments aren't in there yet. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on and take another question. Far corner over there first, and then I'll come back this way. We've got
okay, thank you. I really want to go and pick up on a theme that's starting to emerge from this. I mean, the sustainable farming scheme, which I have to say, speaking as someone in England, I find far superior to anything that's been rolled out by any of the other four home governments in terms of its sort of pragmatic and practical and approach and trying to go and take into account all of the competing issues. But it still only deals with the relationship between the government and the farmer on the farm. But of course, what agricultural policy is about is far more than that. And it may be I'm speaking from a position of ignorance here, but what else is Welsh Government doing to support farming in other forms? I'm thinking of stuff like helping new entrants, helping with knowledge transfer, improving the infrastructure, like the abattoir network in particular, creating local brands and national brands, all those sort of things that would help with profitability alongside the more direct support and payment for public goods approaches, which the Sustainable Farming Scheme focuses on.
Thank you. It's a good question. I will allow a brief response, but I would perhaps say some of those will come up in topic questions, panels later on today. This one is trying to focus on that specific couple of areas of policy. So I'm not trying to fudge and move away from your question, and I will allow...
If you're talking about profitability, there is more to profitability than state payments.
Yeah. No. Taken. Patrick?
Well, just two examples of what I think you're so right that it's really important to look at these other mechanisms, and one would be public procurement. So Gavin Newsom, the governor of the state of California, is about to make an announcement about funding school meals for reasons of improving public health, because they've seen that a long-term investment in good food, sustainably sourced, will benefit the health of the population of California. It seems to me that there needs to be a link made between sustainable farming and public health, and that can go into the procurement of all food from the public sector, schools, hospitals, care homes, prisons. Every bit of food on the public plate ought to come into this thing. And the other thing is about abattoirs. You cannot have local meat, local and sustainably produced meat, without local and sustainable abattoirs. And I expect people will know that the the abattoir in Machynlleth has recently been closed down because of over-regulation effectively. So it's absolutely critical that there needs to be an investment in small abattoirs throughout Wales, as well as public procurement.
Thank you. And I'll come in very quickly on that, saying there are some trials going on in Wales around how we look at abattoirs later, but that's definitely on a panel for later on. And in terms of procurement, there's some interesting work going on closer to home, I would argue. We talked about Caerphilly. They now run the effectively equivalent of the National Procurement Framework for Welsh Government. They've actually just stolen one of our very good officers from Powys to go and support their team, which is great. But across Wales, there's been 2 real live regional trials under dynamic food procurement through the public purse, and there's 2 going on in Wales now, which is great. And we know it's the right thing to do, but we sort of have to reprove it, we have to retest it, we have to see how much is possible, etc., etc. Right, I'm going to take a question at the back, and then we've probably got time for 2 more, so I'll take the gentleman with
question for Dave in general. The Sustainable Farm Scheme proposals, there is very little talk about for young farmer, the next generation. Unless we have a system that looks after future farmers, a young farmer, it all fails. We could sort of talk about all these proposals, and if you don't look after the young farmer, who's going to be farming? And follow-on question in relation to what Geraint asked. You know, I'm coming to the age and thinking, what's the point of all this, isn't it? You know, why work hard to produce food and for little return? And does the ownership of land is sort of being bought, a lot of it being bought up by investors or lifestyle farmers? I'm a bit concerned who is going to produce food, because unless it all changed, the profit from producing food isn't there. The policy, okay, we don't know the figures yet, but we have to look after the young farmer, and I'm just wary there's little or no talk about the young farmer.
Thank you for that. Yes, and young farmers and young and new entrants was mentioned up in this corner as well. So one of the things I'm working on at the moment is, as I said earlier when I was doing my kind of presentation, was we need to make sure that these proposals are accessible to different groups of farmers, tenants, common land graziers. Young and new entrants are part of that mix. As much as these groups of farmers have been in our thinking all the way through, so I wouldn't like you to think that we haven't thought about young entrants until now. However, now that we've got at least a framework of proposals down, then we can start working out in more detail how that impacts to kind of young or new entrants. Whether that's a kind of stepped introduction into the scheme, whether that's kind of financial incentive, I don't know what that means yet, but we are, again, pulling together these groups of experts, of external stakeholders, so not internal Welsh Government, but external people, to try and help us resolve some of those issues. So lots of questions, to which I don't have the answers to yet. Just a few nights ago, I was in Builth giving a similar presentation to this, to the YFC there, trying to kind of mobilise that young voice as well, trying to get as many young farmers as possible to take part in this process, because these are the people who are going to have to kind of be delivering this over the next, coming decades. So I don't have the answers, Hal, but I do realise how vitally important it is that we do have a solution for our young entrants to make them want to come into the scheme. So yes, it's just another one of those challenges on the very long list of challenges that we've got to address.
Thank you. I think I'll just come in very briefly on that. Wales has currently got the highest land prices across the UK. That's a massive challenge for new entrants into farming, not just our young farmers. We're pushing over the £10,000 an acre limit now, and as I say, that's the highest across the whole of the UK. It was never at that point before. I've sadly just lost my second farm within my ward. It was actually an organic holding to a large multi-corporate tree planting company based somewhere in England, if you can find them. But as an ageing farmer, I can't actually blame him. Someone's offering him a really good price for his land. He gets to keep his house. He gets to live where he's grown up and where he's farmed for generations. But somebody else will come in and manage that land very differently. And that's a huge issue. There's conflicting policy interests, there's conflicting support mechanisms for that to happen. And I think you're right, we've got to turn it around a bit and look a bit more inwardly how we support our younger generations to move into farming, but also to remain in farming in those generational ones. And I know there's Farming Connect schemes on intergenerational support and stuff like that, but we can definitely go more if time allows. Sorry, I'm going to take a question from the audience because I think that's probably more important than us talking. Mick.
Sorry, I've got the mic here, so I'm in charge, as my colleague here says. Diolch yn fawr I gychwyn am cyflwyniadau really diddorol. Thanks very much for the discussion. Just a quick question on the 10% of tree cover on farms. Interested to hear Dave and Jerry's take on it. Just clarification, really. Will hedgerows be included within the 10%? We've heard that it might be. The Minister said a statement to that effect at the Senedd, and then there seems to be sort of rolling back of that commitment. I would suggest that they should be included, but hedgerows of a certain standard or quality, well-managed hedgerows. And I think if you did that, it would facilitate two things that we desperately need, I think. More hedgerows in the farm landscape and better managed hedgerows as well. Two things currently which I think is lacking. So I'd like to know, Dave, what is the government's position on this at the moment? And Jerry, as Woodland Trust, do you think that should be included as well?
Thank you, Rhys.
Thanks, Rhys. Okay, so our position at the moment, and again the P word, proposal, is that we've said that hedgerows would not count towards the 10% tree cover action, but they would count towards the 10% habitat action. That said, with regards to the tree action, the tree area, we have said that, and even as these words come out of my mouth, I know how a bit silly they sound, but what we have said is that the hedgerow itself per se would not count towards the tree target, but that any kind of mature trees within that hedge line would. Now, that in itself obviously gives us lots of challenges in terms of measuring and monitoring. So when is a bush becoming a tree? When does an unmanaged hedge line become a row of trees, for example? So we've got to unpick all of those things. Like I said, they are proposals, and there's lots of evidence and views coming in about that. We absolutely appreciate the value of hedges in the landscape for biodiversity, for shelter for livestock, for biosecurity buffers, for shelter, the aesthetic visual impact, multiple values of hedgerows, and we totally do value them. In terms of including them within the target, one of the other things that we have to be mindful of is striking the balance between the maintenance of our existing valuable features versus wanting to create extra where there's opportunity to do that. So that's our position. I know that there's been some conflicting messages, and I think it's about this kind of, we'll need to be very careful about when does a hedge line become a row of trees, etc., etc. But that's where we are at the moment. I suspect that Jerry is going to say something quite different.
Well, only to say definitely hedgerows should count.
Yes.
Now, whether you give farms the choice or whether they assign them to the tree target or the habitat target, I think that's a question worth considering. And my fear is making this too complicated by this sort of division between what is a hedge and what is a tree line. All of these features have a footprint which is easily measured by, satellite. And all you need to do is measure that footprint. And, please, can we keep it simple?
Can I comment on this? Yeah, I was going to just butt in with chair's privilege. I would argue satellite is all right looking down. How do we look into the hedgerow to see that height? Because the scheme sets out an ambition of 3 metre wide hedgerows. That's great. That will increase some of the potential size of it. But what we're talking about here is increasing tree cover, and therefore we've got to raise the height of the hedgerows. Now you can do that through LiDAR and all sorts of quirky stuff, but farmers aren't going to be able to do that, and I would argue it's going to be quite a task that Welsh Government... Sorry, I'm going to move on, if I may, to Patrick first, and then we've got time for one more.
Say that the reason why these outsiders are putting up the price of Welsh land to buy land for reforestation is because the UK Climate Change Committee does not understand agriculture, and that goes really deep, because they've factored in no soil carbon sequestration into their strategy, either for English or Welsh agriculture. And if we were to value the soil carbon stocks that we have in Wales and to pay farmers to increase them if they can be measured accurately, which is coming, then this obsession with trees would reduce a bit, because soil is the second largest carbon bank in the world, and actually a quicker way of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere than reforestation. So it's really important that soil is given a really high profile in the sustainable farming scheme, and ideally incentives to build soil carbon, which needs to be measured obviously from day one.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say there'll be a couple of us in the audience that would challenge that depending on the quality of the soil and what its use is.
You can relate it to soil management, and that will be the challenge for the Welsh Government.
Yeah, I just think we have to be careful that in some cases planting trees improves soil carbon and biodiversity and all sorts of other things. Dennis, did you want to come in on this point, or have you got...
Well, I had about 3 back.
Sorry, go on in. See if we can go back that far, and then I'm going to take one more question and we must finish.
Just to mention young people trying to access the scheme, I've just mentioned county council farms, especially this county, which has about 140, and they're going to be in real trouble, from what I said earlier, real trouble. To do with hedges, the tenant manages the hedge, not the landlord. It'd be much easier to get paid for that than trees. And what about non-stock-proof traditional boundaries? Old field boundaries no longer in use, they're still there. They're now trees, but they're not the landlords to manage. That should come into it. We've got about 8 miles on my farm, out of 14 miles of field boundary. And hedges capture carbon a lot better than trees, better for wildlife, better for particulate capture. And I agree with you about soils, exactly. This tree planting program is a complete nonsense.
Okay, thank you. Very valid points. I think I can answer very briefly from Powis's point of view, being a councillor who actually sits on the farm working group. In our current climate, we have to look differently at everything anyways. You've mentioned the challenges around how we're storing our nitrates and stuff, and that's a real challenge for a large authority that owns a lot of acreage, mostly sheep and beef. So that will be looked at, but it's going to take a while to work with those farmers, work out what's possible, what's not, what can the authority do, what other support can we get in. So yeah, absolutely valid. Right, I'm going to take one more question, and then, I'm tore you now. Mick had his hand up for a long time, but is yours a short one as well? I'll perhaps come back to you if Mick's can be answered in a few seconds. We might come back to you. You could shout. Yeah, go on.
You know, surely an incentive to someone to want to produce food is that they're going to get a fair price for the food that they produce. So, I mean, that's a fairly basic point, I would suggest, and that maybe if there was some sort of policy by which the power of, need I say, who is dealt with, then there might be a fairer marketplace to deal with, and that might help the situation. I've got a couple of points that I just wanted to raise about farms that you're talking about today are very traditional places. They're very they've been handed down from, generation to generation. And I think it's really important to not overlook the importance of small parcels of land that aren't determined farms. They are actually very productive areas within cities, within other places, within rural areas as well, that actually can produce a very important amount of food. And they need to be recognised as part of this picture. And moving on from that, I think that the small scale producer needs to be factored into that, and definitely not necessarily within a traditional farming structure. I think one of the issues that might detract farmers from thinking, well, perhaps we could grow some vegetables, is the fact that their infrastructure might not exist. They might not have the skills. Believe it or not, it's actually quite a skillful business growing vegetables. I know that, that might be a bit of a shock. But it is quite a skillful business, and I think not only will the fear of the actual market, the fact that you can't grow them for money, put them off, but also the fact that the skill level might not be there. So in that case, they might need some support in how they could do that. And my final point, thank you for letting me run on, is, it's just the market. It's just, if we're not going to change the market, if we're not going to pay a fair price for food from the producer, we're not going to get sustainable anything.
Yeah, I'll come back on one or two, but I'll certainly let Dave or others come in on that one. I think you're right. I think early on in the scheme shaping framework, there was almost that trying to balance the scales between supporting production and supporting environmental aims, and it was quite clear from Welsh Government the direction, actually, if you've got a market commodity, there should be a market that supports it, so please do that and earn some money from it. What we're saying is it's a really tough market, and actually without support makes it really hard. So I think the scheme is still in that direction of what we really want to support is in terms of environmental improvements, move towards net zero, climate, nature emergency, etc., while still supporting farmers to grow back. I'm going to let Dave or Tyler or others come in on that one. And then go on, let's do that first, and then I'll come back in on that one. Sorry. Cheers. Butting in.
It's the skills thing I'd like to come back on, actually, because the skills issue has come up several times, not just in relation to horticulture, but in relation to into trees and to improved biosecurity, improved animal health and welfare, all sorts of aspects. And knowledge transfer is mentioned up here in the back corner as well. We certainly have been starting to explore, we are exploring, like I said, part of this kind of co-design survey that we're running at the moment is where we're asking farmers to change or to consider taking on different actions, what are the barriers there? And actually skills and knowledge transfer is coming up more and more and more, which is brilliant that we're getting the transparency over it. And the more evidence like that we capture, then we can start putting support in place to support that. Be it whatever, different sort of demonstration farm, kind of peer-to-peer knowledge networks, collaborative working mechanisms, whatever. So skills is being raising to the top, actually, in terms of issues, and that's one that we're really keen to start tackling.
Thank you. And I'll perhaps pick up on the point of size is really important, and particularly if we're going to try and encourage a mixed, more diverse farming system. So some of the positives I've taken out of the latest paperwork in the scheme, the proposals, as Dave would say, looking at 3 hectares as being the minimum entry level, whereas it's always been 5, set at that quite high threshold for many of our small farmers. That's changed, but now what there is a collaborative option, so farmers can group together as long as there's one farmer over that, whatever the threshold is, it can support other farmers to do more, and that's in terms of creating habitats, corridors, all those sorts of things. But I think that's been listened to. I would argue it's been listened to. We've lobbied really hard. We tried to suggest 2.5 acres. That was a bit too low in terms of, oh my gosh, we're going to support everyone here with a limited resource. So they're trying to find a bit of middle ground. We are out of time.
Sorry, guys, do you mind if I quickly come in on
Go
the
on,
community
very
development?
quickly, Tyler, and then we're going to have a break. Thank you.
And just to clarify that the food bill is entirely separate to the agri bill and what's going on with the sustainable farming scheme and what the Welsh Government are looking at there. But one of the things that we were quite keen on through the secondary food goals is looking at community development, how particularly local food growing can help to, better communities and sort of create opportunities to engage with local food, but also produce opportunities, economic opportunities, social opportunities, things like that. So what our sort of food goals do is tie in and tap into some of these bigger ideas. That food isn't just something which turns up on someone's plate. It has a much bigger role to play in engaging local people, creating opportunities, for example, for health, it's a big factor in that, social development, the employment opportunities, and in particular with the local growing aspect. That's why we were quite keen on having the local food plans, looking at how we can engage with those smaller producers who perhaps may lack the knowledge and expertise in how to get involved with local procurement channels, and looking at ways to sort of almost bring the councils and the public bodies to them rather than the other way around. And we've heard during this whole process of the bill that, you know, there's some very good local infrastructure in places, not so much in other. So it's how we take some of the good things that are happening at the moment and scale this up across the country. Now, you know, it's a very big challenge, and you know, the Agri Bill, this bill, if it passes, doesn't have all the answers to that, but it's starting those conversations and looking at, you know, how we, like I said, bring public bodies to small local producers and actually helping them then tap into that those opportunities, which, you know, can only benefit them in the long run.
Thank you, Tyler. We're going to finish there. Sorry we haven't been able to take all of the questions from the audience. Hopefully you'll get a chance to perhaps raise them during some of the other questions. People are, or some of us are able to hang around, certainly, so collar us between breaks and things like that. Jonty, over to you.
Just to say, please take your cups with you. We're going to have a cup of tea now. If you've got a cup, we're short of them, so take them with you.